Now the Sony FX6 has one major flaw, and that's the fact that it doesn't have a RAW codec internally. However, you can use the Atomos Ninja 5 and 5 Plus with an SSD drive in order for you to store ProRes RAW so you can get some of that workflow in your editing program. So in today's video, we're gonna find out if the juice is worth the squeeze with having ProRes RAW on the Sony FX6. Now, first of all, to get ProRes RAW on the Sony FX6, you have to make sure your Atomos Ninja 5 is not only hooked up, but you have an SSD drive with enough space for ProRes RAW footage. Now the camera can transmit a RAW signal via the HDMI port, especially if you have the new firmware update, so it is fairly easy just to set your camera to ProRes RAW through the HDMI. Now when shooting in ProRes RAW, I'm actually going to set my monitor function over into PQ, which will give me a better look at what the dynamic range is going to look like while using ProRes RAW. On top of that, the way that I expose for ProRes RAW is essentially just using my false colors to make sure that my shadows aren't crushed and my highlights aren't clipped. On top of that, you might want to make sure that you are setting it up to also shoot an xavcs-I Ultra as well, not only so you have a backup, but for the purposes of this video, I need something to compare it to as well. Now everything's set up, you can go ahead and get a bunch of footage, but processing it might be a little bit difficult if you're somebody that uses DaVinci Resolve, which is why I actually use the RAW Recorder app that you could download onto your MacBook in order to convert your RAW footage into Cinema DNG so you could still use a RAW workflow that's on DaVinci Resolve. Now it does come with a free version. I'll leave a link down in the description down below. However, if you do have longer clips, you are going to have to get the professional version. Now you've probably already seen how I color grade xavcs-I footage in a variety of videos on this channel already, but this is going to be how I actually edit ProRes RAW footage on DaVinci Resolve. Now first things first, I'm going to go to my color management tool and I'm going to set up my timeline color space and output color space to be DaVinci Wide Gamut and Rec. 709 Gamma 2-4. Next, I'm going to go into my camera RAW setting and I'm going to set my RAW profile to Sony RAW because I'm obviously shooting in ProRes RAW on the FX6 and my decode using to project. Now, when I input my clip into my timeline, I'm going to go to my camera RAW settings and I'm going to make sure that my decode using is going to be set to clip, and that's going to unlock all of the RAW workflow features that you want out of ProRes RAW anyways. Next, I'll make sure my white balance is set to custom, and as well as I'm going to set my color space to P3D60 and my gamma to linear. Now once that's all settled, I'm going to set up my node tree for ProRes RAW editing. Now the first node is actually going to be noise reduction, because when you are editing off of a RAW codec, because you're going to be recording raw information off of the sensor, you're not going to have the access to have noise reduction that's going to happen in camera. Although I actually turn off the noise reduction in the Sony FX6, I leave this node just in case. Now this might sound a little bit complicated, but I actually am going to make my next node a color space transform. I'm going to transform the P3D60 linear into the S-Log3 S-Gamut.3 Cine because I'm going to use one of my LUTs from my LUT pack in this editing workflow. Now the three nodes that are going to be in between is going to be an HDR exposure setting, a HSL, and my skin tones. Now there are a lot of things that you could adjust in the camera RAW setting, but these are things where I want to get really specific into specific colors, and I actually leave these there just in case the image doesn't look exactly the way I want it to. Now this sucking color space transform might seem a little bit confused, but we're taking that Sony S-Log3 S-Gamut.3 Cine and we're changing it into an ARRI color space. And the reason why is I actually want to leverage the flexibility that I'm getting out of ProRes RAW and work into an ARRI color space. But it does probably sound confusing because we've gone from camera RAW settings to P3D.60 all the way into something that's eventually going to be an ARRI Log 3 setup. Now this might sound a little bit confusing, but I'm going to try to explain this in the easiest way possible. Basically in our project settings, we let DaVinci Resolve know that we're working with raw footage that was filmed on a Sony sensor. Then we actually used a color space that's going to be closer into the ProRes RAW to begin with. Then we actually transformed it into a Sony log space so we could use some of our LUTs on there. And then we translated it into a wider color space in the ARRI Log C in order for us to get a little bit more flexibility, even though that we're using a LUT that was originally made from using S-Log3 footage. ProRes RAW also has a lot of dynamic range, which means that I can use the HDR adjustment settings in order to get exactly what I want. Now in this clip right here, there is a ton of sky, and there's also going to be a ton of information in the highlights, but I want to bring those down and actually give some color to it. I'm going to go over into the highlights and I'm going to make the adjustments to actually bring those levels down so I can see if there's any information in the sky that I can pull from. Now I can actually get a lot of that highlight information back, but I also want to go to the colorize option on here and I want to try to put a little bit more blue teal into the sky to really make the sky pop. Now on top of that, ProRes RAW does really well with shadow information as well. So I actually want to see how deep I can get the blacks while still maintaining my midtones at the same time. So in the same node, I'm going to open up my curves and actually start to bring some of the black areas down to see how far I can get without crushing my shadows. Now we are going to go to the HSL, and I'm going to use the color warper tool for here. Now basically what I want to do here is get the green and the turf to be a certain color that's not too close to where my sky is, as I've put some green into the sky, but I also want to make sure that my trees have a defined color to them as well. So what I'm going to use is the color warper here. I'm going to set my settings to 12 because I am working with a pretty wide color space, and I'm going to start to make those adjustments to see if I can get things to pop, because blue and greens, when they mix in together in the same shot, they always don't look the best. And lastly, we're gonna qualify our skin tones. Now this subject is darker skin and they're wearing a black shirt, so I wouldn't use the eyedropper tool because you're gonna pull your hair out trying to qualify a skin tone. But what I am going to do is use the color warper tool just to see if I can get any more accuracy or any more pleasing tone out of the skin. Now, to be completely honest, this one probably doesn't need as much adjustment as you would think so, mostly because it looks pretty good coming right out of the camera. Now that we're done, this is going to sound a little bit backwards because we're going to go into the color raw tab and we're going to start making some of those Lightroom type adjustments onto this image. The reason why I want to do that is because the camera raw tab is everything that's underneath the hood, underneath the CSTs, underneath the other nodes, and I could dial in things just like the temperature and some of the exposure parts just to add a little bit more finesse into the image. Alright, so this is the actual last step, and we're going to talk about noise reduction a little bit. Now when you're working with raw codecs, you're pulling information straight from the sensor. That means everything as it's getting recorded through the sensor with no in-body noise reduction. Now you can use other programs like Neat Video like you'd find on Premiere Pro or on Final Cut, but DaVinci Resolve has built-in noise reduction into the system itself, which is really nice. And also when you're working with the ProRes RAW type of noise, you actually don't need a lot of noise reduction. I actually put this in the single digits and it cleaned my image up just fine. Now I do leave this step for last because it is processor intensive, and if you guys aren't working with the latest MacBooks or computers, what's going to end up happening is it might slow down the actual playback of your clip. However, this does look pretty good from using the workflow that I'm using, but I'm also going to say I'm not a colorist. So if you guys do disagree with this workflow, that's entirely fine. It's not going to hurt my feelings. However, this is a quick and dirty grade for the sake of this video, so I can actually show you the comparison between that and the xavcs-I footage. So let's move on to the next part of this video. Now that that's done, we're going to do some comparisons between the xavcs-I codec and ProRes RAW. And you guys can comment down below which one you think each clip is, and actually which one you think looks a little bit better. Once you have a system down and your ProRes RAW footage is in a color space that you like grading in, you actually can get some pretty good stuff out of this codec. I do like using the RAW workflows. I did come from a camera system like the C200, and I've also used the Red Komodo for a short time, and to be able to have a workflow that's reminiscent of when I had RAW internal codecs, this is actually a welcome feature and I do like it a lot. On top of that, the ProRes RAW is also going to have great dynamic range, and technically it's more of a 12-bit codec, which is still more than the 10-bit that you're going to get internally in the Sony FX6. Now those all are fun and great, but there are some caveats if you do want to shoot in ProRes RAW. Number one is going to be the additional cost of buying the necessary accessories to shoot in ProRes RAW in the first place. Now the Atomos Ninja 5 original is going to be around $500 US, but you're also going to need an SSD drive in order to store footage to, which might run you up a couple $100. And on top of that, if you are a DaVinci Resolve user, you can use the RAW Converter app. However, you are going to have to pay more money if you're going to go with the professional version, which means that at close to $1,000, you're going to be able to get a feature that already comes internally to a camera like a C70 or the Red Komodo. Now, unfortunately, the cons don't stop there, because the ProRes RAW footage, albeit has a lot of quality, has a lot of information, great dynamic range, and great for color grading, the file sizes compared to xavcs-I codecs, which are already pretty big, are even bigger, which means you're going to have to actually spend more money on hard drives, buy bigger RAIDs, buy bigger SSDs, and overall you're going to spend more money to get that higher quality codec. Now at the end of the day, do I think that ProRes RAW is going to be such a gigantic difference from xavcs-I that it's worth $1,000 to actually go up to? And to be honest, in most situations I don't, but in specialty situations I think it does. Now, if you're shooting something like a run and gun documentary or just client projects that are a little bit smaller in scale that don't necessarily need all the attention and care of something like ProRes RAW, I actually don't recommend using it and saving your money for other things. However, if you are working on big projects, you want to dress to impress, I think ProRes RAW is going to give you a little bit more of an edge in terms of its color and maybe a little bit dynamic range in certain situations. But I will say that if you do want something with a little bit more flexibility, ProRes RAW is going to be the way to go. Unfortunately, you're going to have to pay the cost to be the boss, and if you want to get the best quality footage possible out of this camera, you are going to have to spend the extra money to step up into ProRes RAW, even if it's not a gigantic margin between that and the xavcs-I codec. That being said, leave a comment down below if you're somebody that prefers ProRes RAW as your main editing codec, or somebody that just sticks to the internal at xavcs-I. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, or at least you guys learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.